when Sunshine Fairies rest. Right, Jocelyn? The fairies in the sunshine have many things to do. They are busy night and day, but have rest time too. For always in the sunlight, they do their very best, but when the day is cloudy, the Sunshine Fairies rest. They go to sleep on soft clouds, afloat around the sun, and tuck their toes in cotlets until their nap is done. So when the day is rainy and the dull sky overhead, it's just the soft gray curtain around their doughy head. Then when their rest is over, just as the clouds go by, they all come together, the rainbow in the sky. Welcome to Storytime with Jocelyn. That poem was written by Laura Ingalls Wilder in March of 1915. Hi! It is the 4th week of reading Little House on the Prairie. And one of my favorite chapters we're going to be reading today. I'm so excited. So let us get started. Last week, I know you're so happy, huh? Last week, we read about when the family got sick. Do you remember that? And then the neighbors, the Scotts, had to help them get better. And they had a doctor come help them from the Indian camp. Isn't that sweet? So today, we're going to be starting with a fire in the chimney. The prairie had changed. Now it was a dark yellow, almost brown and red streaks of sap lay across it. The wind wailed in the tall grass and the tan grass, and it whispered sadly across the curly, short buffalo grass. At night, the wind whistled like someone was crying. Paul said again that this was a great country. In the big woods, he had the cut lay and cure it and stack it and put it in the barn for winter. Here on the high prairie, Jocelyn, the sun had cured the wild grass where it stood, and all winter the mustangs and the cow could mow their own hay. He needed only a small stack for stormy days. Now the weather was cooler, and he would go to town. He had not gone while the summer was hot because the heat was too hard on Pet and Patty. They must pull the wagon 20 miles a day to get to town in 2 days, Jocelyn. And he did not want to be away from home any longer than that. He stacked the small stack of hay by the barn. He cut the winter's wood and corded in a long cord against the house. And now he had only to get meat enough to last while he was gone. So he took his gun and he went hunting. Laura and Mary played in the wind outdoors. When they heard a shot echo in the woods along the creek, they knew Pa had got some meat. The wind was cooler now, and all along the creek bottoms, flocks of wild geese and ducks were rising and flying and settling again. Up from the creek came along lines of wild geese, forming in V's for their flight further south. The leader in the front called to those behind him. "Honk!" he called. All down the lines, the wild geese answered one after the other. Honk, 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 honk. And then he cried, honk! And honk, 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 honk. The others answered him. Straight away south, he flew on his strong wings, and the long lines evenly followed him. The treetops along the creek were colored now. Oaks were red and yellows and browns and greens. Cottonwoods and sycamores and walnuts were sunshiny yellow. The sky was not brightly blue, and the wind was rough. That afternoon, the wind blew fiercely, and it was cold. Ma called Mary and Laura into the house, and she built up the fire and drew her rocket near it. And she set rocking baby Carrie and singing softly to her. By lo, baby bunting, Papa's gone a-hunting to get a rabbit skin to wrap the baby bunting in. Laura heard a little crackling in the chimney. Ma stopped singing. She bent forward and looked up the chimney, and then she got up quietly, put Carrie in Mary's arms, pushed Mary down into the rocking chair, and hurried outdoors. Laura ran after her. The whole top of the chimney was on fire. The sticks that made it were burning up. The fire was roaring in the wind and licking toward the helpless roof. Ma seized a long pole and struck at the roaring fire, and burning sticks fell all around her. Laura didn't know what to do. She grabbed a pole too, but Ma told her to stay away. The roaring fire was terrible. It would burn the whole house, and Laura couldn't do anything. She ran into the house. Burning sticks and coals were falling down from the chimney and roaring out of the hearth. The house was full of smoke. One big, blazing stick roared on the floor under Mary's skirts. Mary couldn't move. She was so scared. Laura was too scared to think. She grabbed the back of the heavy rocking chair and pulled with all her might. The chair with Mary and Carrie in it came sliding back across the floor. Laura grabbed up the burning stick and flung it into the fireplace just as Ma came in. "That's a good girl, Laurel, to remember I told you never to leave fire on the floor," Ma said. She took the water pail and quickly and quietly poured water on the fire in the fireplace. Clouds of steam came out. Then Ma said, "Did you burn your hands?" She looked at Laura's hands, but they were not burned because she had thrown the burning stick so quickly. Laura was not really crying. She was too big to cry. Only one tear ran down each eye and her throat choked up. But that was not crying. She'd hid her face against Ma and hung onto her tight. She was so glad the fire had not hurt Ma. "Don't cry, Laura," Ma said, stroking her hair. "Were you afraid?" "Yes," Laura said. "I was afraid Mary and Carrie would burn up. I was afraid the house would burn up and we wouldn't have any house. I'm scared now." Mary could talk now. She told Ma how Laura had pulled the chair away from the fire. Laura was so little and the chair was so big and so heavy with Mary and Carrie in it that Ma was surprised. She said she didn't know how Laura had done it. "You were a brave girl, Laura," she said. But Laura had really been terribly scared. Right, Jocelyn? "And no harm's done," Ma said. "The house didn't burn up and Mary's skirts couldn't catch fire and burn her and Carrie, so everything was all right." When Pa came home, he found the fire out. The wind was rolling over the low stone top of the chimney and the house was cold. But Pa said he would build up the chimney with green sticks and fresh clay and plaster it so well that it wouldn't catch a fire again. He had brought 4 fat ducks. He said he could have killed hundreds, but 4 were all they needed. He said to Ma, "You save the feathers from the ducks and geese we eat, and I'll shoot you a feather bed." He could, of course, have got a deer, but the weather was not yet cold enough to freeze the meat and keep it from spoiling before they could eat it. And he had found the place where a flock of wild turkeys roasted. "Our Thanksgiving and Christmas turkeys," he said. "Great big fat fellows. I'll get them when the time comes." Pa went whistling to mix mud and cut green sticks and build the chimney up again. And while Ma cleaned the ducks, then the fire merrily crackled. A fat duck roasted and the cornbread baked. Everything was snug and cozy again. After supper, Pa said he supposed he'd better start to town early the next morning. "Might as well go and get it over with," he said. "Yes, Charles, you better go," Ma said. "We could get along all right if I didn't," said Pa. "There's no need of running to town all the time for every little thing. I have smoked better tobacco than that stuff Scott raised back in Indiana, but it will do. I'll raise some next summer and pay him back. I wish I hadn't borrowed those nails from Edwards." "You did borrow them, Charles," Ma replied. "And as for the tobacco, you don't like borrowing any more than I do. We need more quinine. I've been sparing with the cornmeal, but it's almost gone, and so is the sugar. You can find a bee tree, but there's no cornmeal tree to be found, so far as I know, and we'll raise no corn till next year. A little salt pork would taste good, too, after all this wild game. And Charles, I'd like to write to the folks in Wisconsin. If you mail a letter now, they can write this winter. And then we can hear from them next spring. You're right, Caroline. You always are, Pa said. Then he turned to Mary and Laura and said it was bedtime. If he was going to start early in the morning, he'd better start sleeping early tonight. I know, Jocelyn. He pulled off his boots while Mary and Laura got into their nightgowns. But when they were in bed, he took down his fiddle. Softly he played, softly and sang. So green grows the larrow, and so does the rue. So will flow my love at parting with you. Ma turned toward him and smiled. Take care of yourself on the trip, Charles, and don't worry about us, she told him. We will be all right. And that is chapter 16. And so you know what that means. We get to open number 16, part of the little house. And what do we've got in here? Let's find out. We got a card that says, there is nothing in the world so good as neighbors. Laura Ingalls Wilder. And we proved that last week, right? When the Scots helped them, Ingalls, while they were sick, they took care of them. In this one, we have Little Town on the Prairie, the Dollhouse version, with all the illustrations. And this book is next in the Little House series. And it was written in 1941 by Laura Ingalls Wilder. It is set in DeSmet, South Dakota. And it opens in the spring after the long, long winter they had to face. And it ends as Laura becomes a school teacher. And she did that to help her sister Mary go to blind school in Vinton, Iowa. Isn't that cute? I know, Jocelyn. And that is part 16. And now we're on to read chapter 16, Pa Goes to Town. So let us begin. You can see him on his wagon, and then you can see the little house from far away. So let's read. Pa Goes to Town, Jocelyn. Before dawn, Pa went away. When Laura and Mary woke, he was gone and everything was empty and lonely. It was not as though Pa had only gone hunting. He was going to town, and he would not be back for 4 long days. That's 2 days there and 2 days back. Bunny had been shut in the stable so she couldn't follow her mother. The trip was too long for a colt. Bunny whined lonelessly. She missed her mother. Laura and Mary stayed in the house with Ma. Outdoors was too large and empty to play in when Pa was away. Jack was uneasy too and watchful. At noon, Laura went with Ma to water Bunny and to move the cow's picket pen to fresh grass. The cow was quite gentle now. She followed where Ma led, and she would even let Ma milk her. At milking time, Ma was putting on her bonnet when suddenly all of Jack's hair stood up stiff on his neck and back. And he rushed out of the house. They heard a yell and a scramble and a shot. Call off your dog! Call off your dog! Mr. Edwards was on top of the woodpile and Jack was climbing up after him. He's got me tread, Mr. Edwards said, backing along the top of the woodpile. I know, Jocelyn. Ma could hardly make Jack come away. Jack grinned savagely and his eyes were red. I know, we like Mr. Edwards. He had to let Mr. Edwards come down from the woodpile, but he watched him every minute. Ma said, I declare, he seems to know that Mr. Ingalls isn't here. Mr. Edwards says that dogs knew more than most folks gave them credit for. On his way to town that morning, Pa had stopped at Mr. Edwards' house and asked him to come over every day to see that everything was all right. And Mr. Edwards was such a good neighbor that he had come at chore time to do the chores for Ma. But Jack had made up his mind not to let anyone but Ma go near the cow or bunny while Pa was gone. He had to be shut in the house while Mr. Edwards did the chores. When Mr. Edwards went away, he said to Ma, "Keep that dog in the house tonight, and you'll be safe enough." The dark crept slowly all around the house. The wind cried mournfully, and owls said, "Whoo! Whoo! A wolf howled, and Jack growled low in his throat. Mary and Laura sat close to Ma in the firelight. They knew they were safe in the house because Jack was there, and Ma had pulled the latch string in. Next day was empty like the first. Jack paced around the stable and around the house, and then around the stable and back to the house. He would not pay any attention to Laura. That afternoon, Mrs. Scott came to visit with Ma. While they visited, Laura and Mary sat politely and as still as mice. Mrs. Scott admired the new rocking chair. The more she rocked in it, the more she enjoyed it, and she said how neat and comfortable and pretty the house was. She said she hoped the goodness they would have no trouble with Indians. Mr. Scott had heard rumors of trouble. She said, "Land knows. They'll never do anything with this country themselves. All they do is roam around over it like wild animals. Treaties or no treaties, the land belongs to folks. They'll farm it. That's only common sense and justice." She did not know why the government made treaties with Indians. The only good Indian was a dead Indian. The very thought of Indians made her blood run cold. She said, "I can't forget the Minnesota massacre. My pa and my brothers went out with the rest of the settlers and stopped them only 15 miles west of us. I've heard Pa tell often enough how they..." Ma made a sharp sound in her throat, and Mrs. Scott stopped. Whatever a massacre was, it was something that grown-ups would not talk about when little girls were listening. After Mrs. Scott had gone, Laura asked Ma what a massacre was. Ma said she could not explain that now. It was something that Laura would understand when she was older. Mr. Edwards came to do the chores again that evening, and again Jack treed him on the woodpile. Ma had dragged him off. She told Mr. Edwards she couldn't think what had got into that dog. Maybe it was the wind that upset him. The wind had a strange, wild howl in it, and it went through Laura's clothes as if the clothes weren't there. Her teeth and Mary's teeth chattered while they carried away armfuls of wood into the house. That night, they thought of Pa and independence. If nothing had delayed him, he would be camping there now, near the houses and the people. Tomorrow, he would be in the store buying things. Then, if he could get an early start, he would come part way home and camp on the prairie tomorrow night, and the next night, he might come home. You see that, mamas? Jack was a good guard dog. In the morning, the wind was blowing fiercely, and it was so cold that Ma kept the door shut. Laura and Mary stayed by the fire and listened to the wind screaming around the house and howling in the chimney. That afternoon, they wondered if Pa was leaving Independence and coming toward them again against the wind. Then when it was dark, they wondered where he was camping. The wind was bitterly cold. It came even into the snug house and made their backs shiver while their faces roasted in the heat of the fire. Somewhere on the big, dark, lonesome prairie, Pa was camping in that wind. Look at that good guard dog, Jack. The next day was very long. They could not expect Pa in the morning, but they were waiting till they could expect him. In the afternoon, they began to watch the creek road. Jack was watching it too. He whined to go out, and he went all around the stable and the house, stopping to look toward the creek bottoms and show his teeth. The wind almost blew him off his feet. When he came in, he would not lie down. He walked about and worried. The hair rose on his neck, flattened and rose again. He tried to look out the window and then whined at the door. But when Ma opened it, he changed his mind and would not go out. Jack's afraid of something, Mary said. Jack's not afraid of anything ever, Laura contradicted. Laura, Ma said. It's not nice to contradict. In a minute, Jack decided to go out. He went to see that the cow and the calf and Bunny were safe in the stable, and Laura wanted to tell Mary, I told you so. She didn't, but she wanted to. At chore time, Ma kept Jack in the house so he could not treat Mr. Edwards on the woodpile. Pa had not come yet. The wind blew Mr. Edwards in through the door. He was breathless and stiff with cold. He warmed himself by the fire before he did the chores, and when he had done them, he sat down to warm himself again. He told Ma that Indians were camping in the shelter of the bluffs. He had seen the smoke from their fires when he crossed the bottoms. He asked Ma if she had a gun. Ma said she had Pa's pistol, and Mr. Edwards said, I reckon they'll stay close at camp a night like this. Yes, Ma said. Mr. Edwards said he could not make himself right comfortable with hay in the stable, and he would spend the night if Ma said so. Ma thanked him nicely, but said that she would not put him in that trouble. They would be safe enough with Jack. I'm expecting Mr. Ingalls any minute now, she told him. So Mr. Edwards put on his coat and cap and muffler and mittens and picked up his gun. He said he didn't guess that anything would bother her anyway. No, Ma said. When she shut the door behind him, she pulled the last string in, though darkness had not yet come. Laura and Mary, Jocelyn, could see the creek road plainly, and they watched it until the dark hit it. Then Ma closed and barreled the wooden window shutter. Pa had not come. They ate supper. They washed the dishes and swept the hearth, and still he had not come. Out in the dark where he was, the wind shrieked and wailed and howled. It rattled the door hatch and shook the shutters. It screamed down the chimney, and the fire roared and flared. All the time, Laura and Mary strained their ears to hear the sound of wagon wheels. They knew Ma was listening too, though she was rocking and singing Carrie to sleep. Carrie fell asleep, and Ma went on rocking. At last, she undressed Carrie and put her to bed. Laura and Mary looked at each other and didn't want to go to bed. Bedtime, girls, Ma said. Then Laura begged to be allowed to sit up until Pa came, and Laura backed her up till Ma said they might. For a long, long time, they sat up. Mary yawned, then Laura yawned, and then they both yawned. But they kept their eyes wide open. I know. Laura's eyes saw things grow very large and then very small. And sometimes she saw two Marys, and sometimes she couldn't see at all. But then she was going to sit up till Pa came. Suddenly, a fearful crash scared her, and Ma picked her up. She had fallen off the bench, smack onto the floor. She tried to tell Ma that she wasn't sleepy enough to have to go to bed, but an enormous yawn almost split her head in two. In the middle of the night, she sat straight up. Ma was sitting still in the rocking chair by the fire. The door latch rattled. The shutters shook. The wind was howling. Mary's eyes were open, and Jack walked up and down. Then Laura heard again a wild howl that rose and fell and rose again. Lie down, Laura, and go to sleep, Ma said gently. What's that howling? Laura asked. The wind is howling, said Ma. Now mind me, Laura. Laura lay down, but her eyes would not shut. She knew that Pa was out in the dark where that terrible howling was. The wild men were in the bluffs along the creek bottoms, and Pa would have to cross the creek bottoms in the dark. Jack growled. Then Ma began to sway gently in the comfortable rocking chair. Fire lit ran up and down, and up again the barrel of Pa's pistol in her lap, and Ma sang softly and sweetly. There is a happy land far, far away, where saints in glory stand, bright, bright as day. Oh, to hear the angels sing, glory to the Lord our King. Laura didn't know she had gone to sleep. She thought the shining angels began to sing with Ma, and she lay listening to their heavenly singing until suddenly her eyes opened and she saw Pa standing by the fire. She jumped out of bed shouting, "Oh, Pa, Pa!" Pa's boots were caked with frozen mud. His nose was red with cold. His hair wildly stood up on his head. He was so cold that coldness came through Laura's nightgown when she reached him. "Wait!" he said. He wrapped Laura in Ma's big shawl and then he hugged her. Everything was all right. The house was cozy with firelight. There was the warm brown smell of coffee. Ma was smiling and Pa was there. The shawl was so large that Mary wrapped the other end of it around her. Pa pulled off his stiff boots and warmed his stiff, cold hands. He sat on the bench and he took Mary on one knee and Laura on the other, and he hugged them against him. All snugged in the shawl, their bare toes toasted in the heat from the fire. "Ah," Pa sighed, "I thought I would never get here." Ma rummaged among the stores he had brought and spooned brown sugar into a tin cup. Pa had brought sugar from Independence. "Your coffee will be ready in a minute, Charles," she said. "It rained between here and Independence going," Pa told them, "and coming back, the mud froze between the spokes till the wheels were nearly solid. I had to get out and knock 'em loose so the horses could pull the wagon. And seems like we'd no more than startled when I had to get out and do it again. It was all I could do to keep Pet and Patty coming against that wind. They're so worn out they could hardly stagger. I never saw such a wind. It cuts like a knife." The wind had begun while he was in town. People told him he had better wait until it blew itself out, but he wanted to get home. "It beats me," he says, "why they call a south wind a northerner, and how a wind from the south can be so tarnationally cold. I never saw anything like it. Down here in this country, the north end of the south wind is the coldest wind I've ever heard of." He drank his coffee and wiped his mustache with his handkerchief and said, "Ah, that hits the spot, Caroline. Now I'm beginning to thaw out." Then his eyes twinkled at Ma, and he told her to open the square package on the table. "Be careful," he said. "Don't drop it." Ma stopped unwrapping it and said, "Oh, Charles, you didn't." "Open it," Pa said. In that square package, there were 8 small squares of window glass. They were glass windows in their house. They would have them. Not one of the squares was broken. Pa had brought them safely all the way home. Ma shook her head and said he shouldn't have spent so much, but her whole face was smiling and Pa laughed with joy. They were all so pleased. All winter long, they would look out of the windows as much as they liked, and the sunshine could come in. Pa said that he thought that Ma and Mary and Laura would like glass windows better than any other present, and he was right. They did. But the windows were not all he had brought them. There was a little paper sack full of pure white sugar. Ma opened it, and Mary and Laura looked at the sparkling whiteness of that beautiful sugar, and they each had a taste of it from a spoon. Then Ma tied it carefully up. They would have white sugar when company came. Best of all, Pa was safely home again. Laura and Mary went back to sleep, very comfortable all over. Everything was all right when Pa was there, and now he had nails and cornmeal and fat pork and salt and everything. He would not have to go to town again for a long time. I'd have to say how precious the blessings that we get to enjoy today, like white sugar, that back then, the Ingalls family barely, when they get it, it was so special that it was only meant for company. Remember that the next time you have sugar or something sweet, because the sweeter it is, the sweeter your life is, because God gave you those blessings. And that was chapter 17. So now we get to open Number 17 of the house, the little house. And what do we have in here? We have a card that says, Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf. Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in here, we have a stocking. And this goes with that chapter. Remember, we've been getting different kinds of these kind of gifts, like the cup, the metal cup, a cookie, a penny. Now the stocking. We're going to get to find out today when we read one of my favorite chapters of this book. But we got a stocking, and it's stretchable. Isn't that sweet? And we'll find out what that stocking means in just a little bit. So now we're going to read chapter 18, The Tall Indian. So let us begin. In those 3 days, the northerner had howled and screeched across the prairie till it blew itself out. Now the sun was warm and the wind was mild, but there was a feeling of autumn in the air. Indians came riding on the path that passed so close to the house, they went by as though it was not even there. They were thin and brown and bare. They rode their little ponies without saddle or bridle. They sat up straight on the naked ponies and did not look to the left or to the right, but their black eyes glittered. Laura and Mary backed against the house and looked up at them. And they saw red-brown skin, bright against the blue sky, and scale plaques wound with gold-colored string and feathers quivering. The Indians' faces were like round red-brown wood that Pa had carved to make a bracket for Ma. I thought that trail was an old one they didn't use anymore, Pa said. I wouldn't have built the house so close to it if I had known it's a high road. Jack hated Indians, and Ma said she didn't blame him. She said, I declare, Indians are getting so thick around here, I can't look up without seeing one. As she spoke, she looked up, and there stood an Indian. He stood in the doorway, looking at them, and they had not heard a sound. Goodness! Ma gasped. Silently, Jack jumped at the Indian. Pa caught him by the collar just in time. The Indian hadn't moved. He stood as still as if Jack hadn't been there at all. How? He said to Pa. Pa held on to Jack and replied, How? He dragged Jack to the bedpost and tied him there. While he was doing it, the Indian came in and squatted down by the fire. Then Pa squatted down by the Indian, and they sat there friendly, not saying a word while Ma finished cooking dinner. Laura and Mary were close together and quiet on their bed in the corner. They couldn't take their eyes from that Indian. He was so still that the beautiful eagle feathers in his scalp block didn't stir. Only his bare chest and the leanness under his ribs moved a little to his breathing. He wore fringed leather leggings, and his moccasins were covered with beads. Right, Jocelyn? Ma gave Pa and the Indian their dinners on 2 tin plates, and they ate silently. Then Pa gave the Indian some tobacco for his pipe. They filled their pipes, and they lightened the tobacco with coals from the fire, and they silently smoked until the pipes were empty. All this time, nobody had said anything, but now the Indian said something to Pa. Pa shook his head and said, No, speak. A while longer they sat all silent. Then the Indian rose up and went away without a sound. My goodness gracious, Pa said. Laura and Mary ran to the window. They saw the Indian straight back, riding away on a pony. He held a gun across his knees. Its end stuck out on either side of him. Pa said that the Indian was no common trash. He guessed by the scalp lock that he was an Osage. Unless I missed my guess, Pa said. That was French he spoke. I wish I had picked up some of that lingo. Let Indians keep them to themselves, said Ma, and we will do the same. I don't like Indians around underfoot. Pa told her not to worry. That Indian was perfectly friendly, he said, and their camps down among the bluffs are peaceful enough. If we treat them well and watch Jack, we won't have any trouble. The very next morning when Pa opened the door to go to the stable, Laura saw Jack standing in the Indian trail. He stood stiff, his back bristled, and all his teeth showed. Ugh. Before him in the path, the tall Indian sat on his pony. Indian and pony were still as still. Jack was telling them plainly that he would spring if they moved. Only the eagle feathers that stood up from the Indian's scalp were waving and spinning in the wind. When the Indian saw Pa, he lifted his gun and pointed it straight at Jack. Laura ran to the door, but Pa was quicker. He stepped between Jack and that gun, and he reached down and grabbed Jack by the collar. He dragged Jack out of the Indian's way, and the Indian rode on along the trail. Pa stood with his feet wide apart and his hands in his pockets and watched the Indian riding further and further away across the prairie. That was a darn close call, Pa said. Well, it's his path, an Indian trail, long before we came. He drove an iron ring into the log of the house wall, and he chained Jack to it. After that, Jack was always chained. He was chained to the house in the daytime, and at night he was chained to the stable door. Because horse thieves were in the country now. They had stolen Mr. Edwards' horses. Jack grew crosser and crosser because he was chained, but he could not be helped. He would not admit that the trail was the Indian's trail. He thought it belonged to Pa, and Laura knew that something terrible would happen if Jack hurt an Indian. Winter was coming now. The grasses were a dull color under a dull sky. The winds wailed as if they were looking for something they could not find. Wild animals were wearing their thick winter fur. And Pa set his traps in the creek bottoms. Every day he visited them, and every day he went hunting. What? And now the nights were freezing cold. Jocelyn, he shot deer for meat. He shot wolves and foxes for their fur, and his traps caught beaver and muskrat and mink. He stretched their skins on the outside of the house and carefully tacked them there to dry. In the evenings, he worked the dry skins between his hands to make them soft, and he added them to the bundle in the corner. Every day, the bundle of furs grew bigger. Laura loved to stroke the thick fur of red foxes. She liked the brown, soft fur of beaver, too, and the shaggy wolf's fur, but best of all, she loved the silky mink. Those were all furs that Pa saved to trade next spring in Independence. Laura and Mary had rabbit skin caps, and Pa's cap was muskrat. One day, when Pa was hunting, 2 Indians came. They came into the house because Jack was chained. Those Indians were dirty and scowling and mean. They acted as if the house belonged to them. One of them looked through Ma's cupboard and took all the cornbread. The other took Pa's tobacco pouch. They looked at the pegs where Pa's gun belonged. Then one of them picked up the bundle of furs. Ma held baby Carrie in her arms, and Mary and Laura stood close to her. They looked at that Indian taking Pa's furs, and they couldn't do anything to stop him. He carried them as far as the door. Then the other Indian said something to him. They made harsh sounds at each other in their throats, and he dropped the furs. They went away. Ma sat down. She hugged Mary and Laura and close to her, and Laura felt Ma's heart beating. Well, Ma said, smiling, I'm thankful they didn't take the plow and seeds. Laura was surprised. She asked, what plow? The plow or all our seeds for next year are in that bundle of furs, said Ma. When Pa came home, they told him about those Indians, and he looked sober. But he said that all was well that ended well. That evening, when Mary and Laura were in bed, Pa played his fiddle. Ma was rocking in the rocking chair and holding baby Carrie against her breast, and she began to sing softly with the fiddle. Wild roved an Indian maid, bright Alpharetta, where flow the waters of the blue Generata. Strong and true my arrows are in my painted quiver. Swift goes my light canoe adown the rapid river. Bold is my warrior good, the love of Alpharetta. Proud wave his sunny blooms along the Janirata. Soft and low he speaks to me, and then his wall, while cross-sounding, rings his voice in thunder loud from height to height resounding. So sang the Indian maid, bright Alpharetta, where sweeps the waters of the blue Janiata. Fleeting years from borne away, the voice of Alpharetta. Still flow the waters of the blue Janirata. Ma's voice and the fiddle's music softly died away, and Laura asked, "Where did the voice of the Alpharetta go, Ma?" "Goodness," Ma said. "Aren't you asleep yet?" "I'm going to sleep," Laura said, "but please tell me where the voice of the Alpharetta went." "Oh, I suppose she went west," Ma answered. "That's what the Indians do." "Why do they do that, Ma?" Laura asked. "Why do they go west?" "They have to," Ma said. "Why do they have to?" "The government makes them, Laura," said Pa. "Now go to sleep." He played the fiddle softly for a while, and then Laura asked, "Please, Pa, can I ask one more question?" "May I?" said Ma. Laura began again. "Pa, please, may I?" "What is it?" Pa asked. It was not polite for little girls to interrupt, but of course Pa could do it. "Will the government make those Indians go west?" "Yes," Pa said. "When white settlers come into a country, the Indians have to move on. The government is going to move these Indians further west any time now. That's why we're here, Laura. White people are going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we get here first and take our pick. Now do you understand?" "Yes, Pa," Laura said. "But Pa, I thought this was Indian territory. Won't it make the Indians mad to have to—" "No more questions, Laura," Pa said firmly. "Go to sleep." And that is chapter 18. So we get to open part 18 of the Little House, Jocelyn. And in here, we just have a card. And it says, one of my favorite quotes from the books, "Remember me with smiles and laughter, for that is how I will remember you." Laura Ingalls Wilder. That is one of my favorite quotes. It's beautiful, yes. And now we're on to Mama's absolute favorite chapter. Mr. Edwards meets Santa Claus. So let us begin, Jocelyn. I'm so excited. I love this chapter. And now we'll get to see the meaning to all the beautiful gifts that we've opened inside the Little House. And there's more to come, of course. So let us begin. The days were short and cold. The wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. Cold rains were falling. Day after day, the rain fell, pattering on the roof and pouring from the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close by the fire, sewing their 9-patch quilt blocks, or cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper, and hearing the sound of the wind and the rain. I know, every night was so cold that they expected to see snow the next morning, but in the morning they saw only sad, wet grass. They passed their noses against the square of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad they could see out. But they wished they could see snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in the Indian Territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know. "What day is it?" they asked her anxiously. "How many more days till Christmas?" And they counted off the days on their fingers till there was only one more day left. Rain was still falling that morning, and there was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. The clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in the clear blue sky. The sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sprinkled onto the grasses. But when Ma opened the door to let in the fresh, cold air, they heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew they would have no Christmas because Santa Claus could not cross that roaring creek. Pa came in bringing a big fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said, he'd eat it, feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for a Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of those drumsticks?" She said yes, she could, but she was sober. And then Mary asked him if the creek was going down, and he said that it was still rising. Ma said that it was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with them. But Pa shook his head and said a man would risk his neck trying to cross that creek now. "No," he said, "that current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow." Of course, that meant that Santa Claus could not come either. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by and such a turkey for their Christmas dinner. Amen. Ma said so, and it was true. Ma said it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but they were such good girls that they hadn't forgotten him. He would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and solemnly said their prayers. They laid down in bed and pulled the covers up. It did not seem at all like Christmas time. Pa and Ma sat silently by the fire. After a while, Ma asked why didn't Pa pay the fiddle, and he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Caroline." After a while longer, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls," she said. "Maybe something will happen." And there's the stocking. Laura's heart jumped, but then she thought again of the creek, and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. "Now go to sleep," Ma said, kissing them goodnight. "Morning will come quicker if you're asleep." She sat down again by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, "You only made it worse, Caroline." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar." But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door hatch rattled and someone said, "Ingalls! Ingalls!" Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning and the outdoors was gray. "Great fish hooks! Edwards, come in, man! What happened?" Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stockings lipping dangly, and she scrawled her shut eyes into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. It was too big of a risk, Edwards, Pa said. We're glad you're here, but that was too big of a risk for a Christmas dinner. Your little ones had to have a Christmas, Mr. Edwards replied. No queek would stop me after I fetched their gifts from Independence. Laura sat up in bed. Did you see Santa Claus? She shouted. I sure did, Mr. Edwards said. Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us? Mary and Laura cried. Wait a minute, Mr. Edwards laughed. And Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings as Santa Claus intended. She said they mustn't look. Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said he had known that Santa Claus could not get across it. But you crossed it, Laura said. Yes, Mr. Edwards replied, but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it where I, a long, lean razorback like me, could do so. And Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no further south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course, he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence in the rain. In the rain, Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street at Independence, he had met Santa Claus. In the daytime? Laura asked. She hadn't thought that anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. No, Mr. Edwards said. It was night. But light shone across the street from the saloons. Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, Hello, Edwards. Did he know you? Mary asked. And Laura asked, How did you know he was really Santa Claus? Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he had recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the biggest, longest, thickest, widest set of whiskers west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, I know, Jocelyn. Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shack bed in Tennessee. And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa Claus had left for him that time. Then Santa Claus said, I understand you're now living down along the Virginius River. Have you ever met up down yonder with two young little girls named Mary and Laura? I surely am acquainted with them, Mr. Edwards replied. It rests heavy on my mind, said Santa Claus. They are both of them sweet, pretty, good little young things, and I know they are expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint two little good girls like them. Yet with the water up the way it is, I can't even make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get their cabin this year, Edwards, Santa Claus said. Would you do me a favor to fetch them gifts this one time? I'll do that, and with pleasure, Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where the pack mule was tied. Didn't he have his reindeer? Laura asked. You know he couldn't, Mary said. There isn't any snow. Exactly, said Mr. Edwards. Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest. And Santa Claus unclitched the pack and looked through it, and he took out presents for Mary and Laura. Oh, what are they? Laura cried, but Mary asked, then what did he do? Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards, and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build. And he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. So long, Edwards, he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge Trail, leading his pack mule and whistling. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of that. Then Ma said, You may now look, girls. Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. You remember the cup? Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own cups. Now each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, and Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again, and they pulled out 2 long, long sticks of candy. It was a peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at the beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick just 1 lick, but Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take 1 lick of her stick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out 2 small packages. They unwrapped them, and each found a little heart-shaped cake or cookie. You remember the little heart cookie cake? Over their delicate brown tops were sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains laid like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. But at last, Laura turned hers over and nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath where it wouldn't show. And the inside of her little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Look at that. You recognize? Well, maybe not one of them, but we'll get to that. Laura and Mary never would have looked in their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak, but Ma asked if they were sure that the stockings were empty. Then they put their hands down inside them to make sure. And in a very toe of each stocking was a shining bright new penny. Remember the penny? They had never even thought of such a thing as having a penny. Think of having a whole penny for their very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. They never had been such a Christmas. Can you think? Just those little things were big things to Laura and Mary. Remember that this Christmas. Oh, this chapter makes me cry. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing such lovely presents all the way from Independence. But they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They had even forgotten Santa Claus. In a minute, they would have remembered, but before they did, Ma said gently, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards. Thank you, they said. And they meant it with all their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hands, too, and shook it again. Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying. Laura didn't know why, so she gazed again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped, and Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they were to help balance the package on his head when he swam across the creek. He thought Ma and Pa might like them with the Christmas turkey. They were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too. It was just too much, Pa said so. "It's too much, Edwards," he said. They never could thank him enough. Laura and Mary were too excited to eat breakfast. They drank the milk from their shining new cups, but they could not swallow the rabbit stew and the cornmeal mush. "Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It will soon be dinner time." For Christmas dinner, there was the tender, juicy roasted turkey. There were the sweet potatoes baked in the ashes and carefully wiped so that they could eat the good skins. 2. There was a loaf of salt rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there was stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made with brown sugar, and they did not have the white sugar sprinkled over their tops. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank their water out of their new cups. And little by little they licked and sucked their sticks of candy till every stick was sharp pointed on one end. That was a happy Christmas. And that is the end of chapter 19. So let us open number 19 of the Little House. And this one will make sense. And here we say, it is the sweet, simple things of life, which are the real ones, after all. Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in this one, we have the peppermint candy stick that the girls got Christmas morning. Isn't that sweet? And that is chapter 19. And we have one more chapter to read for this story time, and it is, a scream in the night. So let us begin. The days were short and gray now. The nights were very dark and cold. Clouds hung low above the little house and spread low and far over the bleak prairie. Rain fell, and sometimes snow was driven on the wind. Hard little bits of snow whirled in the air and scurried over the hunchbacks of miserable grasses. And next day the snow was gone. Every day Pa went hunting and trapping. In the cozy firelit house, Mary and Laura helped Ma with the work, and then they sewed quilt pouches. They played patty cake with Carrie, and they played hide the thimble. With a piece of string and their fingers, they played cat's cradle, and they played bean porridge hot. Facing each other, they clapped their hands together and against each other's hands, keeping time while they said, "Bean porridge hot, bean porridge cold, bean porridge in the hot, 9 days old. Some like it hot, some like it cold, some like it in the pot, 9 days old. I like it hot, I like it cold, I like it in the pot, 9 days old." That was true. No supper was so good as the thick bean porridge, flavored with a small bit of salt pork, when Pa and Ma dipped onto the tin plates when Pa came home, cold and tired from his hunting. Laura liked it hot, and she liked it cold, and it was always good as long as it lasted. But it never really lasted 9 days. They ate it up before that. All the time the wind blew, shrieking and howling and wailing and screaming and mournfully sobbing. They would used to hearing the wind. All day they heard it, and at night in their sleep they heard it and knew it was blowing. But one night they heard such a terrible scream that they all woke up. Pa jumped out of bed and Ma said, "Charles, what was it?" "It's a woman screaming," Pa said. He was dressing as fast as he could. "Sounded like it came from the Scots." "Oh, what could be wrong?" Ma exclaimed. Pa was putting on his boots. He put his foot in and he put his fingers through the strappers at the top of the long boot leg, and then he gave a mighty pull and he stamped hard on his floor and the boot was on. "Maybe Scott is sick," he said, pulling on the other boot. "You don't suppose?" Pa asked low. "No," said Pa. "I keep telling you that they won't make any trouble. They're perfectly quiet and peacefully down in those camps among the bluffs." Laura began to climb out of bed, but Ma said, "Lie down and be still, Laura." So she lay down. Pa put on his warm, bright plaid coat, and his fur cap and his muffler, and he lighted the candle in the lantern. He took his gun and hurried outdoors. Before he shut the door behind him, Laura saw the night outside. It was black dark. Not one star was shining. Laura had never seen such solid darkness. "Ma," she said. "What, Laura? What makes it so dark?" "It's going to storm," Ma answered. She pulled the latch string in and put a stick of wood on the fire, and then she went back to bed. "Go to sleep, Mary and Laura," she said. But Ma did not go to sleep, and neither did Mary and Laura. They laid wide awake and listened. They could not hear anything but the wind. Mary put her head under the quilt and whispered to Laura, "I wish Pa'd come back." Laura nodded her head on the pillow, but she couldn't say anything. She seemed to see Pa striding along the top of the bluff on the path that went toward Mr. Scott's house. Tiny bright spots of candlelight darted here and there from the holes cut in the tin lantern. The little flickering lights seemed to be lost in the black dark. After a long time, Laura whispered, "It must be most morning." And Mary nodded. All that time they had been lying and listening to the wind, and Pa had not come back. Then, high above the shrinking of the wind, they heard again that terrible scream. "Ah!" It seemed quite close to the house. Laura screamed too and leaped out of bed. Mary ducked under the covers. Ma got up and began to dress in a hurry. She put another stick of wood on the fire and told Laura to go back to bed. But Laura begged so hard that Ma said that she could stay up. "Wrap yourself in a shawl," Ma said. They stood by the fire and listened. They couldn't hear anything but the wind, and they could not do anything. But at least they were not lying down in bed. Suddenly, fists pounded on the door, and Pa shouted, "Let me in! Quick, Caroline!" Ma opened the door, and Pa slammed it quickly behind him. He was out of breath. He pushed back his cap and said, "Woo! I'm scared yet." "What was it, Charles?" said Ma. "A panther," Pa said. He had hurried as fast as he could to go to Mr. Scott's. When he got there, the house was dark and everything was quiet. Pa went all around the house listening and looking with the lantern. He could not find a sign of anything wrong, so he felt like a fool to think he had got up and dressed in the middle of the night and walked 2 miles, all because he heard the wind howl. He did not want Mr. and Mrs. Scott to know about it, so he did not wake them up. He came home as fast as he could because the wind was bitter cold, and he was hurrying along the path where he had went on the edge of the bluff, when all of a sudden he heard that scream right under his feet. I tell you, my hair stood up till it lifted my cap, he told Laura. I lit out from home like a scared rabbit. Where was the panther, Pa? She asked him. In a treetop, said Pa, in the top of that big cottonwood that grows against the bluffs there. Pa, did it come after you? Laura asked, and he said, I don't know, Laura. Well, you're safe now, Charles, said Ma. Yes, and I'm glad of it. This is too dark of a night to be out with panthers, Pa said. Now, Laura, where's my boot jack? Laura brought it to him. The boot jack was a thin oak slab with a notch in one end and a cleat across the middle of it. Laura laid it on the floor with the cleat down and the cleat lifted up the notched end. Then Pa stood on it with one foot and he put the other foot into the notch. And the notch held the boot by the heel while Pa pulled his boot out. Then he pulled off his other boot the same way. The boots clung tightly, but they had to come off. Laura watched him do this, and then she asked, Would a panther carry off a little girl, Pa? Yes, said Pa, and kill her and eat her too. You and Mary must stay in the house till I shoot that panther. As soon as daylight comes, I will take my gun and go after him. All the next day, Pa hunted that panther, and he hunted the next day and the next day. He found the panther's tracks, and he found the hide. and the bones of an antelope that the panther had eaten. But he did not find the panther anywhere. The panther went swiftly through the treetops where it left no tracks. Pa said he would not stop till he killed that panther. He said, "We can't have panthers running around in the country where there are little girls." But he did not kill that panther, and he did not stop hunting it. One day in the woods, he met an Indian. They stood in the wet, cold woods and looked at each other. And they could not talk because they did not know each other's words. But the Indian pointed to the panther's tracks, and he made motions with his gun to show Pa that he had killed that panther. He pointed to the treetops and to the ground and to show that he had shot it out of the tree. And he motioned to the sky and west and east to say that he had killed it the day before. And that was all right. The panther was dead. Laura asked if the panther would carry off the little papoose and kill and eat her too. And Pa said yes. Probably that was why the Indian had killed that panther. And that is chapter 20. And that is the end of the chapters for this week. And let's open the biggest parts of the little house, the door. Number 20. And inside this door is a card. Ooh, nothing. And the card says, "Remember well and bear in mind, a constant friend is hard to find." Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in this door is a doll, a rag doll. Isn't she cute? And if you'll, she matches a little bit matches my bonnet. In later chapters, you'll learn, or books, I'm not sure you meet her in this book, but this is Charlotte. This is Laura's special rag doll that she remembers. And we have rag dolls like my Raggedy Ann that's special to me. We all have something that we grew up with that's special to us. And Charlotte was very special to Laura. Right, Jocelyn? And that is part 20 of the little house. And next week, we will open up the last of the 4 parts of the little house. And we will read the last of the 6. We have actually 6 more chapters. And we will be done with Little House on the Prairie and the month of September. So I hope you will join us for the end of Little House on the Prairie. And we will see you for the end of What's Inside the Little House. And we will see you later. Have a blessed week. And thank you for joining us for Storytime with Jocelyn. Bye-bye.